Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be talking about bondage. This is a continuation of my BDSM 101 series, so if you want to see more videos that talk about just basic types of play and elements of BDSM, I would highly recommend checking out my BDSM 101 playlist, which I will put in the description below if you want to check that out. As well, if you're interested in learning more about bondage, I have an entire episode on the podcast I help do, which is called Kink Your World, where we literally spend an hour just talking about bondage. So I will put a link in the description box as well if you want to check out that episode. It's a pretty good time, and I think it definitely goes more in depth into this subject that I can just do in like a 10-minute long video. So, first things first is, what is bondage? This is how I started all of my 101 videos, I know, but it is very, very important to get down. Basically, bondage is just when you restrict or restrain somebody. That's really all it is. Now, obviously, the physical form of this is the most common, but bondage does also incorporate mental elements, and I'll talk a bit more about both of those in a bit, but bondage is very much a core part of BDSM. It's the B in BDSM. It's been around longer than BDSM itself has, so it is definitely something that a lot of people are into. There are even people who are bondage purists who the only reason that they participate in BDSM is to do bondage. There's entire communities that are just based on bondage that are even separate from the rest of the BDSM community. What makes bondage so popular though? Probably, at least in my educated guess, the variety of it. There are so many ways to do bondage. There are so many ways to restrain people. One of the most common ways is with rope. This is called rope bondage. Unsurprisingly, even within this category, there are a lot of different ways of doing it. There is shibari, which is a Japanese style / Japanese influenced form of rope bondage that is typically more focused on the aesthetic than purely the tie and how restrictive it is. On the other end of the spectrum, you have American style tightrope bondage, which is very utilitarian and less concerned with aesthetics. It is just about tying somebody down as hard as you can and as securely as you can, and it's about the feeling more so than the aesthetic part of it. And regardless of what type of bondage you're doing, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So it can definitely be aesthetic, it can be a physical sensation, it can be a sexual thing, and I'll talk more about that, but suffice to say, that will apply to any type of bondage. There's also metal. Typically, this is either going to be something like, say, handcuffs, or it's going to be something like chain. Chain could be used for completely wrapping somebody up in. It could be used to restrain somebody to a tie point on a wall or on a piece of furniture. It could be used between a pair of shackles. It can be used for a lot of different things, and it's very cheap. So even if you just go to Home Depot and you get, 100 feet worth of chain, you will find a way to use it. There's also more common and more simplistic forms of bondage that require maybe a little bit less forethought and a little bit less skill than something like rope bondage. These would be things like vet wrap, for example. This is very good to use for binding up somebody's limbs. So, for example, tying somebody's arms down like this, or tying their hands together, or wrapping around their face, or something like that. The advantage of vet wrap is that it's more breathable, it's cheap, and it's easy to find. Similarly, people use things like silk ties. This is a very, very classic introduction, kink, vanilla level type of thing. And I don't necessarily mean that in a derogatory way. It's just what everybody pictures when they think of bondage and BDSM. I actually wouldn't recommend using things like silk ties or silk scarves because they can slip and they can cinch down very easily. Cinching down is bad because it could cause unexpected injury to your partner, and if you don't have the right equipment, it can be very difficult to remove in an emergency situation. There are more specialized things as well. For example, there is bondage tape. It looks in a lot of ways like duct tape, but unlike duct tape, it only sticks to itself. It's kind of like duct tape and saran wrap had a baby. Uh, but it can be very colorful. It's very easy to find in pretty much any sex shop, and it's a great way of trying out bondage in a way that is very, I'm not going to say low risk completely, but it is something that is less risky than, chains or rope bondage or something like that. You can use it to cover somebody's mouth. You can use it to cover even over their whole face. You can use it in pretty much all the same ways you would with vet wrap. It just sort of depends on which feeling you like. As well, there are things that are specialized pieces of clothing or furniture. On the furniture side, this is typically going to be something like a cage or something that has a lot of restraint points already built into it that maybe has other utilities in BDSM, like for example, a spanking bench or a St. Andrew's cross that has points for somebody to get tied down to. There's also specialized clothing. Like I said, this is going to be something like a straight jacket. Something that is specific to BDSM is an arm binder. This is something where somebody has their arms tied out like this, but behind their back. Is usually made out of leather, and it's used to restrain them so they can't use their hands or their arms, and is typically coupled with something like bondage restraints. This is a specialized set, typically including cuffs that go around the ankle, the wrist, sometimes the waist, sometimes the chest, and around the neck in the form of a collar. Usually this is leather, but people also use things like vinyl and faux leather and all sorts of stuff, but typically it's going to be made out of some kind of leather. And you can substitute things like bondage tape for the restraints, but they're so versatile. A lot of times when you are making a first purchase in BDSM, you should be concerned about, how am I going to be able to use this in the future? And restraints lend themselves to so many kinds of play. So if you're considering that, highly recommend checking out actually getting a restraint set. This is a specialized set, typically including cuffs that go around the ankle, the wrist, sometimes the waist, sometimes the chest, and around the neck in the form of a collar. Usually this is leather, but people also use things like vinyl and faux leather and all sorts of stuff, but typically it's going to be made out of some kind of leather. And you can substitute things like bondage tape for the restraints, but they're so versatile. A lot of times when you are making a first purchase in BDSM, you should be concerned about, how am I going to be able to use this in the future? And restraints lend themselves to so many kinds of play. So if you're considering that, highly recommend checking out actually getting a restraint set. There is also mental bondage, because bondage is at its core just about restraining somebody. You don't need to use physical objects to do that. In a lot of power exchange relationships where there's a lot of trust built up, you can do things like mind control or hypnosis type things, which are controversial for obvious reasons, but those can be seen as a form of bondage. You can also even just mentally bind somebody without doing mind control by, giving them an order or commanding them to do something, and either instilling fear in them that something bad is going to happen or that punishment is going to happen, but for some reason either forcing them to do an action or to not do an action or stay still or not talk or not move or something that involves, rather than using something like a rope tie, is instead using the force of the mind of the dominant to restrain the submissive from acting on something. Now, with bondage, no matter what type you're doing, be that physical or mental, you do need to be aware of the risk that they involve. And I'm not going to be able to do an exhaustive list in this video, but typically if you're doing something like a mental bondage, you need to be aware that there could be some emotional fallout, that it could be extremely emotionally draining or too mentally overwhelming. It can involve a lot of things like fear play. It can involve a lot of things that surround negative emotions. So you just need to be aware that there could be a hair need for aftercare. It will typically require a lot more advanced negotiation than some other forms of play. With physical bondage, it really depends on the set that you're using or the item type that you're using or how you're using it. But really, with bondage, there's a few things that at least I want to clear up misconception-wise. If you are doing bondage and you are doing a tight tie or using tight restraints, discoloration of the limbs is not by itself a warning sign and not by itself a danger. The thing that you need to know when you're doing bondage that actually is an indication of something going wrong, something that can actually cause long-term damage, is nerve damage. There are specific signs that people can learn to detect and to feel that will indicate that there is potential nerve damage happening, and there are plenty of resources out there for learning what that looks like. I would just recommend Googling, nerve damage or whatever, but compression by itself is not an issue. People can be in very tight ties for a long period of time, but so long as they're not experiencing anything that is going to impinge on a nerve or otherwise causing them to be at risk of nerve damage, it's really not something to be super concerned about. If you're doing something like vet wrap or rope or something involving cloth material, you need to keep a pair of safety scissors on hand. You need to be prepared for an emergency situation where you're not going to have the time to be able to unlock all the restraints or be able to untie all the ties in order or be able to completely unmummify somebody. You will need to cut it off as quickly as possible, and the way to do that is with safety scissors. They are very cheap. You can get them at medical supply stores, or you can get them on Amazon for like $3 to $5. I would personally not play with somebody using those forms of bondage if they did not have those pieces of equipment on hand. The risk with using regular scissors is, of course, stabbing the person, accidentally cutting open their skin, or the device not actually being able to cut through because it is too dull. Whereas with safety scissors, depending on the type, they can be one use only, so they should be extremely sharp. But, it's just really best to plan for the worst possible situation and to just be risk aware. If you're dealing with something like metal, it's going to be a lot harder to just cut through the metal, obviously. So what do you do in that situation? Either you risk aware and you accept the fact that, yeah, I could be completely covered and wrapped up in metal like a mummy, and that could be a bad situation for me, and I may not be able to get out of it, and I'm okay with that. Or you can do things like if you are binding somebody in a way to where, let's say, they're shackled together and their ankles are connected by a link of chain, you can do something to where the points that it actually connects to the restraints at are something you can cut through, like leather or cloth or a zip tie or something. So rather than having to try and cut the metal, use something you can cut through right away that's very easy to get through and is not going to cause any issues. But really, if you're interested in a specific kind of play, you need to do very thorough research about the type of bondage. You need to know as much as you can about the safety of that, how to cope with emergency situations. I cannot cover all that in this video, but I at least wanted to mention it so people are aware that bondage is not risk-free. I wouldn't even recommend something like handcuffs to people who are new. I actually wouldn't recommend handcuffs to anybody because there are so many better alternatives out there. Unless you really enjoy the pure uncomfortableness of being in a pair of metal handcuffs, it's really easy to lose the keys. They can get stuck easily. They're not super comfortable for a lot of people. There's just better alternatives out there. If you're interested in using something like handcuffs, I recommend using leather restraints or links of chain rather than handcuffs. But I could go on a whole other rant about handcuffs. That is really all I wanted to cover in just this very basic overview of bondage. If you're interested in learning more about bondage or incorporating bondage into your scenes, I recommend just going to your local dungeon if you can. Go to a bondage night, either watch people do bondage scenes or go to a class where you can learn about a specific type of bondage. Like I said in the video, things like bondage tape and vet wrap are very cheap, simple, and relatively low risk ways to try out bondage. Just make sure you have a pair of safety scissors on hand and you should be good to go. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to put that down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from people. If you have any video suggestions, please do share those as well. I make videos twice a week, and if you haven't already and you want to keep up with me and my life, I highly recommend subscribing to this channel and checking out my social media. If you guys like this video and you want to see more, please do consider going to my Patreon. That is how I'm able to fund things like getting new lighting and new cameras, which is actually happening. Next week, I should have my new camera, and I won't have to film with all of this grainy, weird off lighting, and I'm so excited. Ooh, I'm so excited. Anyways, that is what I wanted to cover in today's video, so I will see you all again soon, and until I see you next time, hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.